Are you like me? You can't remember important things, but you can remember weird old video games that you saw in a magazine or G4 or on TV somewhere years and years ago, a game that maybe never even came out, but you still think about to this day? That's what this series of videos is. We're on part 4? Part 4 of weird canceled games I still think about. I'm not talking like PT or Scalebound or even that Prey game. Oh man, 1313. Like those are like the canceled games we all know of and talk about a lot. But I like to go and dive into like the weird ones that kind of get forgotten by video game history and the culture. There's a lot of cool stories in video game history and stuff. A lot of stuff I will link in the description down below. And also please check out my previous videos where I talked about a lot of games, like these games. Andrew, can you put some games that I talked about here? I love reading your comments for suggestions of other games I should talk about. A lot of you guys mentioned ones I previously talked about in other videos though, so I'm just saying. But yeah, let me know some that you think of in the comments. The first one I want to talk about today is actually a game that did come out, but a previous version of it. Metal Gear Solid Rising. Yeah, not Rising Revengeance, the Platinum Games over-the-top action combat Raiden game. No, there was a lot to this one before it became that. So this was actually announced as a Kojima Productions game called specifically Metal Gear Solid Rising. So it would be another game in the Metal Gear Solid series, another Metal Gear game. When this game was first teased, first announced, it was at a GDC in, I believe, 2007. There was like a cool image of Raiden with just bold, the next MGS. So that was a big deal. Very quickly, though, this project wasn't going to be headed up by Hideo Kojima, series creator. He was apparently still very much deep in the weeds on Peace Walker for a good period of this time. But essentially, Kojima's team after Metal Gear Solid 4 was looking what else to pursue, and there were a lot of ideas thrown around, and the original concept here was to detail the buildup to Raiden becoming the awesome cyborg ninja as he was in Metal Gear Solid 4. Because when he shows up in Metal Gear Solid 4, it's like, holy shit, what? The reveal of that was incredible. I still remember to this day. But yeah, so this game was originally intended at some point to kind of fill in the blanks of how he got to how he is. Obviously, there's some provided in Metal Gear Solid 4, but you would have played as a cyborg ninja for this whole game, but it kind of would have been like an early prototype Raiden cyborg ninja, and you would kind of work your way up. And I really would have loved to have seen how that would have been portrayed, what story ramifications that would have had, because obviously what we ended up eventually getting from Platinum Games is totally different. This game was revealed during an Xbox like E3 thing. Hideo Kojima came out on stage 2 years in a row to talk about this game with Don Matrick during the Xbox 360 era and talking up the tech and how, hey, we wanted to come up with a cool new experience on Xbox 360. It was eventually going to be multi-platform, but we got an initial early trailer teasing Raiden slicing up a very cool looking Metal Gear kind of cyborg human character thing. And this was, of course, when they showed the tech demo of Raiden famously slicing the van in half, slicing the watermelons and stuff, but that wasn't always intended for Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. There was something else here. And that's what I want to see, dude. That's what I keep thinking about, is what this could have been. Obviously, Yoji Shinkawa contributed to Raiden's design, but he was more on board and Hideo probably more as well, would have come up with something, but ultimately this game was shelved for a while because they couldn't figure some things out, and then ultimately it was revived and given to Platinum Games, who created Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, which is something. A truly special, weird, strange game, but this game takes place after the events of Metal Gear Solid 4 and also kind of acts as like a what if and goes off and whatever. I really like it, but I don't take it seriously as a Metal Gear fan. I don't know like what that says about me. I'm like a purist, a snob, but like it's the Armstrong, all that stuff is great. There's some really cool moments in that game, but it's adjacent. Whereas the original Metal Gear Solid Rising could have possibly fit more into the Metal Gear Solid lore that I actually care about. Who knows what could have been? They were probably throwing around all kinds of crazy ideas for that game, but it was actually apparently supposed to be more stealth-based. Once Platinum got their hands on it, they completely ditched the stealth concepts and also changed the location. And obviously the story had gone through a rewrite, but there was originally supposed to be more of a stealth-based approach because it was a Metal Gear Solid game, so it was like more of a hunting, stalking type of thing where You'd sneak up behind enemies, take them out, and then quickly backflip away and hide and be acrobatic like Raiden was in Metal Gear Solid 4. Or if you want me to go back even further, the original Metal Gear Solid VR missions where there was a couple bits where you could play as a cyborg ninja and like flip around and take out guards. They were going to go for something like that, and that could have been really, really cool. Along with that, they also were talking about how possibly because of the Japanese censorship and the gore of like slicing a man into a million pieces realistically, they didn't want to do, but it was apparently going to have human type characters and cyborg characters, and how you take out human characters was going to kind of be like an ethical thing where it's like, oh, Raiden isn't going to just chop up humans. He's not that evil, but sometimes he has to, and you have a choice to take them out stealthily or non-lethally, whereas the robots were the ones you could just slash up all the time. But humans, you wouldn't get rewarded for slashing up. So they had all these concepts they were working with. Clearly, it never really worked out, and that's why we have Revengeance, which is insane, and that's fine. But I can't just help think of like what could have been. The early days of that lead up and that announcement was very, very exciting. Hey, now before we talk about the next game, I want to give a big shout out to the sponsor of this video, Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian approved meals right to your doorstep, and they've been feeding me for a while now. Like I've mentioned in other videos, I'm still in the process of moving. I'm living out of boxes, and my kitchen was a mess, totally in flux, and between work and moving, sometimes it was hard to worry about meals, and that's how Factor really came in clutch. I'm not worrying about going to the grocery store or doing meal prepping. These meals show up fresh and they're nutritious, delicious, and I can heat them up in the microwave in minutes. I'm not splurging on last minute fast food or junk food. I'm just totally good to go here. And thankfully, they give you tons of choices so everybody is covered. They offer keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan and veggie options, which include seafood, meat, and plant-based meals. So there's just a lot of ways to eat right, feel good. They offer smoothies if you're on the go. It's really good, tasty, easy stuff to take advantage of. So if you want to check it out, you want to get fed, all you got to do is head to factor75.com and use code ONJAKE50 for 50% off your first Factor box. You can also click it in the description down below to get eating. That's factor75.com. Use code ONJAKE50 and go eat. Have fun. And big thanks to Factor for sponsoring these videos. Now, another one I want to talk about is one that I completely forgot about. It was buried in the back of my brain, but I was like active and doing video game stuff at the time. There was an Apocalypse Now video game, like an officially licensed real Apocalypse Now video game based on the movie, endorsed by director Francis Ford Coppola, and it never happened. But it had a Kickstarter and everything. This was in 2017, and it was like a company called Killspace, and it was founded by people behind Fallout New Vegas, Wasteland, just coming from a bunch of studios, some heavy hitter RPG type guys, and they essentially launched a Kickstarter for this ambitious Apocalypse Now official game. The Kickstarter was trying to raise $900,000. It very quickly only hit like $100 and something thousand, and then they got off Kickstarter and tried to like do funding on their website, and it just kind of eventually fizzled out. The Kickstarter, even some people thought it was kind of sketchy because there was typos and stuff, and they didn't actually launch it with a trailer. They launched a trailer a little bit later, and it was like rendered like game kind of. It was really just like a recreation of the Apocalypse Now trailer, but like we got to see like a computer rendered Martin Sheen, because you were going to be playing as his character, you know, the main character of the movie, and they threw around all kind of buzzwords about what this game would actually be. I want to read the statement just because it's so everything. We're making a first-person perspective survival and horror game with strong role-playing elements, no open world, no long walks, no Twitch shooting. Okay, so first of all, sorry to interrupt, but what? So you don't want to make like a Twitch action shooter, but you also just threw shade on walking simulators, or really just story-based games, when Apocalypse Now was a notoriously very slow, methodical, thought-provoking movie. Okay, whatever. All tension, all tactical decision-making, some outcomes determined by player skill and some by character skill, psychological decision-making in your dialogues with other characters, and a heavy emphasis on an RPG-like narrative with branching outcomes. Jesus Christ, they just said every single type of video game. And ultimately they ended up making nothing because nothing ever came of this. But in that initial trailer, like there was a couple little snippets that did look more like horror game. Like you see Martin Sheen's Benjamin, covered and crazed with a machete creeping through. There could have been something there, but again, it comes back to mentioning what I talked about in other videos, like the canceled Taxi Driver game, where it's based around an incredible, thought-provoking, deep and heavy movie that doesn't glamorize these things. It's kind of weird to make a game out. Like Apocalypse Now had statements, and it was basically the opposite of cool action army war movie or video game things, violent things you would do in video games. Same thing with the Taxi Driver game. So it was like, what is it? Really, Francis Ford Coppola signed off on this? He signed off on it, but he didn't clearly put anything behind it because like this Kickstarter was launched as kind of like a wet fart. A lot of people didn't even realize. So I don't know, ultimately weird idea and it never happened. And The Verge did an article. Apparently there were some issues with the company and there's like, people who work there saying one thing, management saying different things. Apparently it was a mess. So if you want to read up on all that stuff, I will link that in the description as well, because video game making is always a fascinating story, even when it's a game that was barely a game and never came out. Now, next up, I want to talk about another one that like is a game that released, but there was a previous version of it that was completely different, and that's Splinter Cell Conviction. I know in Game Ranks we talked about this briefly in a video, but I didn't write any of that. I kind of want to dive into it here. In 2007, Splinter Cell Conviction was revealed, following up on the events of the previous games where Sam's been having it rough. He's on the run. And this game was heavily going to be inspired by kind of like Bourne Identity, badass man on the run type of thing. And we got a trailer, a very rough trailer, like a clearly like technical early alpha trailer, just showcasing gameplay elements. And then there's a lot of off-screen footage out there from like game developer things and like press things, just showcasing the game's systems. Very early work in progress, but essentially this is where a lot of you guys have heard this before. Like it's been dubbed Hobo Sam. It's Sam Fisher with a beard, raggedy clothes, and his hood up because he's just trying to blend in and hide in the crowd. And Splinter Cell Conviction originally had really ambitious ideas centered more around social stealth and in-city, in-moment kind of Bourne action. Very Assassin's Creed at the same time, which you can understand why Ubisoft maybe changed direction, but like blending in crowds, there was apparently a mechanic where you'd hide into a crowd and then it would switch to first person and you'd see people in the crowd like looking at you and reacting to you and making conversation with you, and you can only stay with them for a minute before they got suspicious as security guards walk around, and you'd be able to go on the run, you'd be able to drop like IED explosives and distractions in places and then run away, you'd be able to pick up objects in the environment and throw them. It was kind of like a brawler where you weren't just gunning down people, you were just picking up a cafe table or a chair and throwing it at a guard and running away to escape. There's a lot there, not only just from what was shown, but like think about it. Think about how many movies where, like there's a clever, crafty guy who sneaks through a crowd into an alleyway, drops something into a garbage can and walks away and causes a distraction and does something completely different. There is totally a whole game based around those cool types of slick feeling things that sneaky badass dudes do in the public eye or right in public without anybody noticing. Obviously, Assassin's Creed capitalizes on some of that, but there's a whole different kind of spy thriller way to do that hasn't really been done in games. And I think they were onto something. I assume that's what they were kind of onto here. And the vibe was pretty cool, like a park in Washington, D.C., like by the mall, like at the sunset, like around all the war memorials and cafes and stuff like that. Like it just kind of felt unique. It felt very different. Granted, Splinter Cell Conviction did take some of that, the imagery of the Washington Monument and a lot of it being in Washington specifically, but I still thought they had some really, really cool and unconventional ideas in that original version of the game. Maybe there's a little Watch Dogs in there now. Some of that DNA maybe has carried over, but still, I think there could have been something completely different and special with that original Conviction. I feel like those ideas were totally like wasted potential. I still like Conviction, even though it's very different than the other games, but yeah, that's where that's at. And another interesting one, an obligatory one, but a weird one, is Project Offset. That name has sat in my head for so long, and I kind of forget what it was, but it was like this medieval fantasy game with like breathtaking graphics that just never came out. There was a lot of hype around it. There's so many videos out there floating around, tech demo, just like details of the villains and the goblins and the monsters' faces. And this was something that was in the works by a company called Offset Studios, who had developed a lot of graphics technology and stuff that would make its way into like the CryEngine and Crytek games. But their game was essentially this medieval fantasy type game that was really ambitious storytelling where you'd play as multiple characters. And it was going to be a first person experience that also switched to third person during combat. We've seen some of that combat demoed, swapping between first person with like a sword or a crossbow and then jumping into third person and seeing more combos and blocking and parrying. And it actually looked pretty cool. And visually for the time, it was pretty damn solid looking with dark, spooky castles that you're in interiors, but then like big battlefields, and the tech was apparently going to be able to show hundreds of soldiers on screen at once. There was so much floating around about this one, but it never ultimately resulted in a thing. The way it wasn't going to be like an open world thing, it was going to be a story-based thing, kind of reminded me of Rise, Son of Rome, where it's really good graphics, big battles, ambitious sieges, but ultimately like a third-person character killing dudes and stuff like that. There was also a lot of story concept stuff where you'd play as different characters, like you'd play as a big warrior, a sneaky rogue, a weird goblin, and it would be different times, and things would jump around in different order. So like you'd play as one character going to a village and doing a thing, then later on you'd play as another character going to that village and it would be completely burned down and totally transformed. Fun, interesting stuff for a game. But ultimately, Offset Software was purchased by Intel in 2008, and then eventually things kind of just fizzled out. A lot of people thought Intel was going to use this tech for stuff, but maybe the game would still be around, but now that's not the case. It was officially totally canceled, and even like Project Offset stuff just redirects to Intel's website. But thankfully there's internet archives out there where you can look up Project Offset's old website. They had some really cool concept art and just interesting descriptions of the game. And then like I said, if you go on YouTube, there's tons of footage out there, even officially released stuff from IGN where there was something there, and that honestly something kind of like a narrative, cool first and third person adventure would be something I would definitely play. But Project Offset is no more. But it is another now technically worthless game or thing that will take up valuable real estate in my brain, just like all the other games I've been mentioning in this series. So I want to know what you guys think about these games specifically. Do you have any experience of like looking forward to them, reading about them, hearing about them? And of course, other examples, I'd love to hear some of your picks down in the comments. There's always some good shit to talk about, so hit me up. But if you like this series, like I said, be sure to go back and check out the other videos I did, because there's a lot of video game history there. But also, if you just like what I'm doing here, talking about stuff I love, stuff I find interesting, clicking the like button does actually help me, so thank you. Big thank you as well to the sponsor of this video and YouTube membership and Patreon backers, and all of you. Thank you for being here. I'm Jake Baldino. Subscribe because video games, pizza's on me.